the ALA released the numbers for 2022, and it is now 1,269 attempts to ban books, which is nearly double the number for 2021. A total of 2,571 unique titles were targeted for censorship, a 32% increase over the previous year. 3 years ago, folks, it was 156 attempts for the entire year. And lest anyone think this is merely school boards run amok, 58% of the challenges were in schools or classroom libraries or school curricula. 41% were targeting the collections of public libraries. And in 40% of those cases, 100 or more books were targeted in a single attempt. So we've been watching this develop over the course of the last few years. In Florida, the teachers of Manatee County literally covered all their books with paper, fearing prosecution of felonies under their new law. As of November, Missouri had banned 300 books in 4 months, ranging from Shakespeare to the Gettysburg Address to the Children's Bible. A Virginia lawmaker sued Barnes & Noble last May to prevent them from selling a memoir titled Genderqueer to minors. A school in York, Pennsylvania banned a children's picture book titled I Am Rosa Parks in 2021. And in February of last year, a Tennessee pastor led a literal book burning called Deliverance from Demons, with the crowd throwing copies of Harry Potter and the Twilight series into a bonfire following the decision by a local school to ban the Holocaust graphic novel Mouse. So since the beginning of the year, the students at Sigma Tau Delta have been watching the rising tide of book banning with enormous concern. After all, books are what we do, words are what we do. The official Banned Books Week had already come and gone very quickly, but we felt this issue was far too important to be noticed in a single week and then ignored the rest of the year. From books about Roberto Clemente, to children's books with daddy penguins, to classics like To Kill a Mockingbird and Of Mice and Men, a children's book on the 1963 March on Washington, to the books we're studying in our own classrooms here at SIUE, like Fun Home and Sula by Toni Morrison. It seems no book is safe from challenge. And it's easy for us to dismiss the issue as a problem that's happening far away from here. But as we've seen, what happens in Florida rarely stays in Florida. Right across the river in Wentzville, we saw several books banned, including Fun Home, Lawn Boy, The Bluest Eye, and other books reflecting communities of color, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized groups. So as one who's made my living with the written word for 25 years, as a journalist and as a writer of fiction, I certainly find this trend abhorrent. But we have a lovely group of experts here who each has a unique perspective on this issue, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they have to say, and not just because it's going to save my voice. I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them to share their top concern or insight into this issue that we face. And then we'll get into some questions and issues that were compiled over the last couple of months by the members of Sigma Tau Delta. Meanwhile, the Sigmas, raise your hand, Sigmas. The Sigmas are going to be circulating with index cards. If you have a question that you would like to pose to our panel, signal one of them and put your question on the card. They're going to check them just to make sure that it's not something we've already covered. And then they will hand the cards to me towards the end, and we'll get a chance to pose them to the panel. That makes sense to everybody? Nodding? Great. So first, I need to inform you that we're short one panelist. Tony Rothert with the ACLU had to cancel this afternoon due to COVID, and he says that he would, as much as he is tempted to come anyway, he's sure we all appreciate him staying at home and taking a pass on this particular event. Dr. Timothy Lewis is an identity politics researcher, social justice activist, and assistant professor of political science here at SIUE. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the historic Tuskegee University, as well as a Master of Science in International Relations from Troy University and a PhD in Political Science, from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Dr. Lewis specializes in the politics of marginalized identities, with research on the socio-political reality of African Americans across reputable peer-reviewed journals. As a certified diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice trainer and workshop facilitator, he is engaged in activism on varying topics, including Black Lives Matter, reparations to African Americans, the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, and critical race theory. He is a member of the American Political Science Association, Southern Political Science Association, the Northeastern Political Science Association, and the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, and was honored with a resolution for service in higher education from the Missouri House of Representatives in 2021. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Blythe Barnhard, down at the end there, has reported for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch since 2007, first covering healthcare and now education. For the past 4 years, Barnhard has also worked as an assistant editor guiding other journalists in the newsroom. She graduated with a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Southern California and previously covered healthcare for the Orange County Register. Leah Gregory is currently membership coordinator and school library liaison at the Illinois Heartland Library System. She's worked in many career areas, including restaurant management, legal secretary, agriculture sales, electric motor sales, and preschool teacher, which is very impressive, and eventually landed a librarianship and has been working in and for school libraries ever since, including 14 years as a middle school librarian. Leah is passionate about reading, literacy, libraries, and intellectual freedom. And as I mentioned, of course, I'm president of Sigma Tau Delta and SPJ. I am a journalist and author with more than 25 years in the word business as a newspaper reporter and fiction author. I hold a bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee, a master's degree in media studies from SIUE, and I'm currently a graduate teaching assistant here at SIUE while completing an MFA in creative writing, and I teach journalism as an adjunct instructor at St. Louis University. I'm also a freelance writer, photographer, author of horror and science fiction, and serve on the National SPJ Ethics Committee. Whew, I got through the bios. So let's start at the end, Blythe. I know that you're somewhat limited in what you're allowed to express, but what can you tell us about what you've been doing with this issue?
Well, I think that this is a topic where journalists should not stay neutral. Banning books is objectively bad, and I'm not shy about saying that because it's a short road from banning books to stifling freedom of the press, and that's obviously very important to me. So thanks for having me, and
Great.
Happy to talk about my experience over the last few years, as you mentioned, as these book bans have exploded.
Oh, we're definitely going to get to Wentzville.
In our area.
All right, Dr. Lewis.
I believe that the question that was posed to us was, what is the primary concern that we have with the issue of banning books? And I want to begin my answer by posing a hypothetical to you. Let's say you noticed a lump on your body, and you went to a licensed oncologist, and that doctor who specializes in the treatment of cancer informed you that your lump was indeed cancerous, and that you need to start considering treatment options. How many of you, by a show of hands, would get a second opinion from a plumber? I don't think many. I don't think many, or if any, would seek a second opinion from a plumber, because even though being a plumber is a respectable profession, their skill set does not give them the insight into the intricacies of diagnosing cancer. What does this brief illustration have to do with the banning of books? This illustration outlines the dangerous practice that is becoming more and more common in our political reality. At the center of banning books across the country, and it is the practice of inflating the common opinion of people to the merit of a proficient specialist. You see, according to the American Library Association, there are two groups who have the largest support for the banning of books. Those are Republican parents and white parents. When we examine states like Florida, Texas, Tennessee, and even Missouri, where these bans are taking place, we are seeing a dangerous reality. One where certified teachers, principals, and credentialed librarians are no longer the experts on education, but the opinions of white moms with no certifications or credentials now supersede the pedagogical training of education professionals. And it is the opinion of these white suburban moms that have now begun to shape school boards, K-12 curricula, and educational standards. So when I am asked what I find to be most concerning about the book bans taking place across this country, the most concerning thing to me is that we are equating the opinions of the privileged with the competency of the experts.
Thank you. All right, Leah.
How close? Can you hear me? My main concern when it comes to book banning and book challenges, and I work with libraries every single day. I was on the phone for an hour with the librarian this morning who was facing having to route every book she picked for her library through the district office from now on. So I work with librarians every day who are seeing this happen. And my biggest problem with this is that the actual number of people who want to ban books are a small minority of people, but they are loud, they are organized, and as much as I hate to admit it, they are effective at what they are doing. So I want to talk about what regular people who aren't librarians, who aren't teachers, but who care about the fact that books should not be banned, what you guys can do to make sure that the voices of the majority are heard.
Okay, thank you. So for any of you, how do you, when you take a look at this current round of book banning, similar to past efforts, how is it different? I rattled off a lot of statistics at the opening that shows that there's more of it, but how alarmed should we be? How is it different than previous efforts that we've seen? Anybody?
I can say that from what I am seeing, it is different because they are targeting marginalized people, in my opinion. They are not, they're not being shy about it either. They're not, I see people running for library boards who are saying, I'm a conservative Christian, and that basically says, I don't want to read or hear about anybody else. So that is something that I'm seeing. I feel it is much more politicized and much more strategic in what they are trying to get out of libraries.
I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with previous book bans because they didn't happen. We didn't see book challenges. So the school districts that I cover are dealing with this for the first time ever. And I mean, we're talking, 20, 30 years. So it's clearly a political moment. That's what's driving it. I think there's also ulterior motives to undermine our trust in public institutions, schools, libraries, with an ultimate goal of defunding those institutions. So it's not even really about the books. Many people who are challenging the books haven't read the books. They're passing around lists, sharing lists. See if this book's in your kid's library. So I think this is new.
Dr. Lewis?
I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
Respectfully. The entire notion of preventing certain groups from having exposure to literacy is not new. There's a famous name that you guys may recognize, the name of Frederick Douglass, the infamous abolitionist. Frederick Douglass was actually born a slave in Maryland in 1818, and he was owned by a man named Hugh Hall. Hugh Hall was one of the most racist white men in historical record. Hugh Hall, though, was married to a woman by the name of Sophia, and Sophia began to teach Frederick Douglass how to read. When Hugh found out that his wife was teaching the young boy how to read, he became infuriated, and these are the words recorded in history. Hugh said that Frederick should know nothing but the will of his master, to learn and to obey it. As to himself, referring to Frederick, learning will do him no good, but it will do him a great harm. If you teach him how to read, he'll then want to know how to write. And when this accomplished, he'll be running away by himself. Hugh told his wife essentially that learning would be harmful for Frederick Douglass, and that it would eventually lead Douglass to want to disassociate himself from the system in which he was treated unfairly. The current book bans are literally the twin brothers of the anti-literacy laws that characterize the dehumanizing system of slavery here in the United States. In Florida, they are even blocking math books because they see them as too woke, quote unquote. It is no surprise that the framing of this is that these books are harmful, the exact same word used by Hugo Hall in the 1820s. So this prompts me to think of a very important question, one that is introspective as well. If 32 states currently in the US have reached back 200 years to ban minoritized people from getting access to books, how much progress have we really made? If the language of Hugo Hall from the 1800s conveys the same literary deception as DeSantis, Abbott, and Youngin, can we say that we are progressing, or have we simply retrofitted the same monster of bigotry and called it educational oversight?
I'd like to talk about a little bit more on the educational side, where we have, and we brought up the issue of people whose expertise is, shall we say, not in education, superseding that of educators. We all know that reading is a foundational skill. It is critical to future learning and to exercising democratic freedoms. Those of us in education already know that the habit of reading, at least that which is not required, is sometimes challenging to reinstall in our students. That's one way to put it. So what effect is it having on learning when we are limiting or removing books in young classrooms, do you think? Leah, if you want to take that one.
Okay. So kids will read if
Right.
they're excited about what they're reading. And if you tell me not to read a book, I'm going to go right out and read it. So in some ways, as Stephen King says, if they ban a book, get your you-know-what to the library and find out what they don't want you to know. So in one hand, I've seen a very encouraging trend for students to become activists on their own behalf to fight book banning in their school districts. But in other districts where the expertise of the librarian and the teacher are overlooked, this is not made up, this is completely true. A librarian submitted a book order and her superintendent struck out every book that he thought could be considered inappropriate if a parent saw the list. And it was everything to do with culture, accepting other cultures, anything to do with race, and a book about how women got the vote. They are not interested in educating students. They are interested in not making the newspaper. They don't want anybody to complain to them about anything. And I think it's important that students take it to the newspaper and tell them that their school board has said that we can't read these books.
Well, what's happening is that these bans are not being enacted evenly across areas, and they're not being enacted evenly across all schools. So if you're in a private school, an independent private school, you're probably not seeing this at all. I mean, there's a school, Crossroads, in St. Louis that has a whole course on banned books. They have a whole course on graphic novels, and graphic novels are what's being targeted in Missouri because of a new law. And then there are districts that are banning dozens and dozens of books, and there are districts that are saying we're not gonna take out a single book. So it depends on where you live, which is unfortunate, your access to books.
I was going to ask about how much of a difference we see between public and private schools as to their attitudes. Are we finding that more or less restrictive? Or?
Well, interestingly, this law in Missouri, which is makes or prohibits giving any sort of materials that are sexually explicit in nature, and there are exceptions for anatomy books and some history books, but it's
David.
very subjective. So, but what's interesting is that the law does apply to private schools, and so this makes it illegal. It makes it a misdemeanor, which is punishable with a fine, I don't know, a couple $1,000s, but up to a year in jail. So there's some fear out there, but we don't really know what's happening in private schools because they're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act or Sunshine Laws. So they don't have to tell us what books they're taking out or whether they're taking out any books at all. So the answer is I don't know.
I can speak to that a little bit. I work with a group of school librarians throughout the state, and at our recent conference, there were quite a few private schools there, and the librarians are fighting just as hard to keep the books that they feel that are important for their students to read in the system. The problem, and they're not as subject to as many laws or, as you said, like the Freedom of Information. So they oversight. Yes, that's what I was trying to say. So they have a little more freedom both ways. They can restrict more easily, but they can also put books on the shelf without having to really justify it. So we're seeing some of the same problems. So
There's a quote from author Judy Picoult, 20 of whose books were recently banned in Florida, that has gone completely viral. And she said, "There is absolutely nothing wrong with a parent deciding a certain book is not right for her child. There is a colossal problem with a parent deciding that, therefore, no child should be allowed to read that book." She also was, in several of the interviews, she's been very much in the center of this because so many of her books were banned, that marginalized children reading books about marginalized characters wind up feeling less alone. And a lot of the organizations fighting this, PEN America, for example, have leaned heavily into this idea that young people deserve to see themselves reflected in their library's books. What do we think about this and about why they're going after identity-based books? Dr. Lewis, you might want to take one. I'm just guessing.
I do not have a prepared answer for this question. However, it has always been a common practice to have a boogeyman in politics. And if I can paint the non-heteronormative community or black people or feminists as the boogeyman, you're so focused on the boogeyman, you're so scared of this phantom fictional character that you totally ignore me not doing my job. So there's no scrutiny on the politicians. When inflation is high, there are potholes the size of Venus. All of those things they should be addressing because you are focused on the boogeyman that they've created.
I did hear a librarian push back on Picoult's quote, saying that there is a problem with preventing your own child from reading a book, let alone everyone else's children. But we should, we talk a lot about parents' rights, that's the buzzword, but children have rights too. And students have rights, and students have intellectual freedom. And if your child is seeking out books from the library, which, by the way, have already been vetted by professionals to be age appropriate, and if your child is interested in a library book, who are we to tell them no, that's not right for you? Who are you to discourage that intellectual curiosity of a child? I mean, read all the books you can.
Read every book. Yes.
I certainly did.
We talk to librarians a lot of times. When a parent calls a librarian, they say, I don't want my child to check out Harry Potter. And we're like, it's very easy for a librarian to put a note on that child's record and say, Mom and Dad say no Harry Potter. But that mom and dad cannot say that no child can read Harry Potter. I feel sorry for their kids, but I can't go into their home and tell them how to parent their child. But what I always tell librarians, and I try to make this my message everywhere, is libraries in schools and public are for everyone, not just the straight, white, regular people that they consider normal. Libraries are for everyone, and the collection has to reflect that.
One of the frequent counter arguments that we've heard bounced around about this tries to refocus it on this new trend of rewriting books like Dr. Seuss, Roald Dahl, etc., removing problematic language or plot points that, shall we say, belong to an earlier era. Do you see this as the equivalent of book banning, or is it just distracting from the issue? Nobody wants to take that one?
For many years, I was always taught that it was considered censorship, that if you change an author's original intent, it was considered censorship. Mm-hmm. My point of view with those kinds of problematic books, for instance, I grew up loving Little House on the Prairie. I had no idea that it was problematic, none whatsoever. But instead of saying, you can't read Little House on the Prairie, I feel that you should say, well, maybe this isn't the best way to look at this period in history, and this is why, because it sugarcoats the way the Native Americans were treated. And can we find a book that effectively deals with what really happened? So I think the books are there, and they were written when they were written, but there are alternatives that can teach the same things. I don't necessarily think we should rewrite the originals, but I think we should point out that they are problematic and go with something else.
I mean, I think there's a difference between a government agency banning a book and a publisher, ideally the author, if they're still around, making those changes themselves. I mean, I heard a story about a play. I can't remember, it's the Spelling Bee musical, and a high school was putting it on, and parents were objecting to some of the language in this play, and I didn't know this, but apparently when high schools license plays to put on, there is a different version. There is a the high school version of this play, and so the playwrights were happy to help make some adjustments, but they're not going to change the plot. They're not going to change the characterization. But if there's a word that they could swap out, they were happy to do that. And so I think there are healthy ways to go about that. And there were parents who were saying, well, we don't want any of these, we don't want this character to sing this song about being sad or being bullied. And they're like, no, we're not changing that. And they came to some compromise. So I thought that was interesting, but yeah, I don't think we can draw parallels between those. Yeah.
Any thoughts, Dr. Lewis?
Nope.
Okay. It seems as though we've talked a bit about these are challenges being organized through a few organizations such as Moms for Liberty You see them pop up quite a bit. I cannot remember the statistic off the top of my head, and I forgot to write it down, but that something like hundreds of the challenges can stem back to one or two people. It seems, how much do you feel that this is an organized effort, and how much really are individual parents or small groups acting on their own? Anybody?
This is a pet peeve. So,
Sure.
when we generalize those questions like that, I think we need to specify the parents we're talking about. I don't see any black parents championing the banning of books, the banning of Toni Morrison or any of these other books. I don't see any Latino parents championing these books. We need to be specific on the demographic that we're talking about, because when we say generalized statements that this is what parents want, we're totally overlooking the cultural differentiation across communities that determine not only the different styles of parenting, but the different values of parenting. And those values are what are driving these individuals to champion these book bans. So which parents are we talking about?
I mean, the book challenges are coming from a very small segment, and you're right, they're white moms, white suburban moms, and so speaking of sunshine requests, when we were trying to figure out which books had been banned in each school district, we requested the challenges, and which is there's a form you can fill out, and you put your name on it. You can't be anonymous, and so we printed the names, and then they would get really upset. Well, you can't print my name. Well, that's a public document. That's a public record. You're putting you're brave enough to challenge a book, but you're not brave enough to put your name behind it. That's kind of questionable. But what we've realized is that, sometimes they don't even have kids in that school where they're trying to ban a book. But you're right. I mean, in the school districts that are majority black in St. Louis, they're not banning books. They are not banning books, and frankly, the Attorney General doesn't care. He's not going after them. That's not where his voters are. So he doesn't care what they read, which again tells you it's not about the books. It's not about protecting kids.
I agree that it is highly organized right now. I worked in a middle school for 14 years, and I had a handful, maybe 3 parents call me to complain about a book. And every time I was able to say, I understand you, I hear you, let's just talk about what you would like your child to read, and we can work this out between us. And it never got to a book ban. But now, right before I left my school job, I was part of the FOIA request where an organized group wanted to know if we had any critical race theory books in our entire district. And then I started to talk to the school librarians. Every district in the state of Illinois got that FOIA request. Somebody was organized enough to try to target critical race books in every district in Illinois.
So your feeling is that there is some coordination
Yes.
between these groups, that these individuals or groups that are doing this. There are some who claim that banning books in school and libraries isn't actually banning, because you can still go into a store and buy them, except of course in that one place in Virginia. So what do you think about that?
This is my pet peeve.
Mine too. We can.
Oh, good.
Because I'm calling it a book ban, and we're putting you banned books, we're putting that in the newspaper, because if you're pulling a book from a shelf and not allowing any of your students to check it out, you are banning that book. I think they know banning books is not a good thing. And most people are opposed to book bans. So they try to say, no, it's just parental restriction, or we're just culling books. That's the normal process. And no, it's a book ban. Book banners don't like to be called book banners, but
And with the numbers, it's hard to argue that this is business as usual. Anyone else?
I guess my question would be is why should I purchase a book that I've already purchased? Because see, most libraries are funded through tax dollars. That means that when that library has decided to select that book, my tax dollars purchase that book. So why should I then turn around and purchase that book again?
Good point.
I always say ban does not mean that you've made it disappear from the face of the earth. You've just made it impossible for your kids to get. And if you are a kid who doesn't have a ride to the public library, or maybe you're in an underserved area where you can't join the public library, or you don't have money to go to a bookstore, or the bookstore doesn't carry what you want to read, that book is as impossible to get for you as if it were wiped off the face of the earth.
I recall some of the backlash against the Stephen King comment that was mentioned earlier. Get to the store and get what they don't want you to read, because there's a certain privilege attached to that, that presumes that everybody has those resources. Dr. Lewis, I'd like you to address this one. It's clear that many of these challenges fall under "we don't want to talk about race," and they throw around catchphrases like woke, and they deride critical race theory as they disallow books like The Autobiography of Rosa Parks. What can we say about this?
First off, you can ask them to define woke and critical race theory. And that's
Good luck.
going to shut down about 75% of all of your arguments. Brianna Jo Gray, it's a viral video. You should go out and look at it. She just recently asked Bethany Mandel to define woke, and she couldn't do it. Most of them cannot define these terms that they are using. And if they do define them, you will not find that definition in incredible academic source. Because I am a political scientist, what I do is when these bills come out, I go and I read the bills. So in every standard bill, there's supposed to be a section for definitions where they define these terms. What is missing, particularly in regards to critical race theory, is the definition from every single bill. So let me just give you a little information on what critical race theory actually is. First off, there is no K-12 curriculum in the U.S. teaching the complex framework of critical race theory. It is just not happening. Let me explain to you or give you the academic definition of critical race theory. It is a practice and theory of study for disadvantaged and intersectional identities, investigating to what degree past discriminatory practices and policies have residual effects that impact current realities of political and social minorities. The area of study centers 5 learning components: the centrality of race and racism, a challenge to a dominant social ideology, a commitment to social justice, a centering of experiential knowledge, and a transdisciplinary perspective. By this very definition of critical race theory, in order for any public school teacher or teacher aide to teach CRT, they would have to be an interdisciplinary expert, proficient in subordinate and dominant social political ideologies, taught through a pedagogy that includes social justice activism. That is not happening in any K-12 school in the United States. What is happening is there is a telling of history without the whitewashing or filtering that we are used to, and that is making people uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the same as oppression.
Many people have noted, shall we say, some historical echoes in the current trend of book banning, especially in light of the increasing interference in schools in what and how they teach. I wish that I could have gotten the photo that I found yesterday of that book burning in Tennessee, because it looked very much like something that could have been pulled out of a history book. What are some of the historical echoes that you see in these trends?
Well, the phrase that I always like to repeat is that book banners have never been on the right side of history, so don't join them.
During the 1950s and 1960s, and probably before, almost every state in the U.S. had sodomy laws. which were laws that were banning the consensual sexual act between people of the same sex or gender. And as part of some of those states' punishments, and I'm blanking on the state in the Northeast particularly, I believe it was Connecticut, one of the punishments was that your library card was revoked.
Really?
Yes. And so this notion of, again, targeting minoritized groups to prevent them from reading and engaging in literacy and acquiring knowledge through reading is not a new practice. It has been around as old as this country is.
I want to back up for a moment, and Blythe, I want you to talk to us a little bit about Wentzville. I'd also intended to have Tony Rothert talk a bit about the lawsuits that the ACLU filed, but I know from my own experience covering highly controversial topics that your, quote, reader feedback can sometimes be a bit heated, sometimes abusive or threatening. But more importantly, as the person in the room, you're going to have a unique perspective on what people are, how people feel in the community, how much support does it really have, and what is the sense you get from being the person in the room?
Well,
As much as you feel comfortable saying.
Yeah, this is the first time that we've been called groomers for interviewing teenagers and kids. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And so that's been different. But to the last question first, real quick, I just wanted to say that I mentioned graphic novels earlier, and I think graphic novels have become really popular, and graphic novels are reaching a whole different segment of kids who may not have been readers. They're, more accessible to different kinds of learners and neurodiverse learners. And so I think when we're taking out graphic novels, that's an additional shame for children who prefer. It's still reading. It's you can have audiobook. This is
It's
a
all
more
reading.
visual book. So I think that's really unfortunate. And once you're banning a graphic novel like 1984, which was banned in the Kirkwood School District, how do you justify leaving in the text version? I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I forgot the question.
No, I mean, your sense of the community as well. I mean, it's easy for us to assume, I suppose, that if a school board passes this, then that must mean the majority of the community is behind it. But having covered those myself, I know that's not always the case.
It's really complicated because this law was passed, and it prohibits the distribution of materials with explicit sexual content. And, so lawyers for the school districts got really skittish, and, they'd rather you go overboard and just pull every book. And so the Wentzville School District pulled every book with any kind of image that may or may not fall under that. I mean, that's what's so tricky is, they write these bills that don't have definitions that, and then they're threatening you with jail time. I mean, so I think we'll see teachers leaving. Well, I think we'll see librarians trying to go to, friendlier districts. On the other hand, I don't think anybody wants to go to jail. So it's tough. And I don't think school boards are acting because, on behalf of their community necessarily. I think they're responding to what their lawyers are telling them to do. We've seen, like in the Clayton School District, Clayton, Kirkwood, these are the top performing academic school districts that have banned books, and we've seen alumni come back and say, this is embarrassing, and you're damaging the reputation of the school district. So, I mean, there has been a lot of pushback, but I haven't seen anybody, once you ban a book, it's really hard to bring it back. So I haven't seen any books return to shelves. I'll say
That's
that.
funny. There's a lot of claims that there are. Well, we uncensored the Bluest Eye or whatever, but you're not seeing it actually happening. Then.
No, I mean, Wentzville was the first to ban books in this latest round, and they banned the Bluest Eye, and that was before the law went into effect. Once the law went into effect, they pulled like 200 books from shelves, and they did return a lot of those books, so those were pulled for review. So they weren't technically banned. But no, I've never seen a book come back from banning in these past few years.
Much of this debate seems to center on sexuality, that children are too young to read sexually explicit topics, depending, of course, on how you choose to define that. And as we've seen, definitions are a problem. How can we address this concern without shredding all of Toni Morrison?
Okay. Toni Morrison her book, particularly Beloved, has been at the center of a lot of debate. It's currently banned in 11 districts. And it's always, when it's banned, there's always this conversation or this framing that it's banned because of the sexual nature in the book. Let me tell you what the book Beloved is actually about. Beloved is a book that examines the destructive legacy of slavery. It chronicles the life of a black woman named Seth. Seth is a slave pre-Civil War in the state of Kentucky. She escaped slavery to Ohio. Although Seth lives there as a free woman in Ohio, because of the slave patrol, her and her family are obviously recaptured and reintroduced into slavery. Now, this is based on a true story by a woman, a slave, named Margaret Garner, who in 1856 escaped slavery from Kentucky to Ohio. And in the true story, what happens is Margaret is so traumatized from what she went through in slavery, being raped consistently, that when the slave patrollers are about to reclaim her and her family, she kills her own daughter to prevent her daughter from living through the trauma of slavery that she went through. The supposed sexual content in the novel is not the consenting acts of intimacy that is sex. It's really about the truthful horrors of slavery, like sexual assault, rape, female genital mutilation, and all of those common practices that went on during slavery. And so when we frame questions as how do we protect children from the sexual content, I take issue with that question. Because if white children are too young to learn about the horrors of slavery, then what about the black children that actually went through the horrors of slavery? If white children are too young to experience racism, then maybe society needs to do a better job to ensure that black and brown children don't go through that racism.
I'd like to follow up on that, because it's clear beyond the sexual content, a significant number of banning attempts are focused on books that center on race, both historical and contemporary. What effect have we seen, or can we observe on minority children no longer seeing their own history, and on white children who aren't being exposed to it at all?
There is something called the residual effects of slavery and Jim Crow. If you don't know what a residual effect is, think about the last time you baked something in the oven. After the allotted time, you took that item out, even though you turned the oven off. And the reason you took it out is because if you had left it in there, the residual heat would have burned the item. Residual effects are the items that linger even though the legal mechanisms have been put into place. And when you filter out or don't allow a particular child from a minoritized or disadvantaged community to read about their history, they cannot then in turn identify the residual effects. So this is a particular targeted practice to keep certain demographics ignorant, because I don't know what I've been through. I don't know what I'm going through as a result of what I've been through.
Other thoughts?
This is particularly concerning to me because a big buzzword in schools right now is social emotional learning. And yeah, we
You gotta
want
give us a definition.
you know, social emotional learning is we want kids to feel good about themselves and be secure in themselves so that they can learn. But if you're banning books that target them, I don't see how you can expect any social emotional wellness at all. Kelly Yang wrote a book called Front Desk about her family's experiences when they immigrated to the United States. And I always like to tell this story because my kids and my school was predominantly white because that's where I lived and taught. My kids loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. So her book was banned because it was causing trouble, because it addressed immigration and the troubles that the girl went through. And I tweeted her, and she retweeted me. I was so proud of that. The only trouble that book ever caused was when 3 kids got into a pushing match over the last copy. So I'm like, it's not, I mean, it is lifting people up. These books are lifting these kids up. And if you really want to address their social emotional wellness, you have to let them see themselves in their stories and in their books.
So now, Leah, your job involves coordinating with librarians on a regular basis. And you mentioned before some of the efforts that they seem to be going through. What's your sense of how the librarians are dealing? What measures can they take to keep books on the shelves without fighting a daily battle? And how is their morale?
This is such a good question. It's so timely because we are actually in the process, in a partnership that our library system is the south part of the state, and there's one in the north part of the state, like the Chicago suburbs, and then there's one that's Chicago. And we are all working together to form something we're going to call a rapid response team, so that if a book is banned, there is somebody to call immediately for help, so you know what to do. The other thing that we have done to help librarians is we've created a list of resources, and we've separated it by library. So if you're in a school library, if you're in a public library, if you're in a prison library, if somebody wants to ban a book, you go to the list and you're like, this is where I am. I don't have a policy and I need to start here. Policy is very important. I know everybody hates like writing policy and thinking about policy, but if you don't have a policy, you don't really have a leg to stand on. I tell every librarian, I'm like, no matter how hard you have to fight, you have to have a policy to say, A, what you're going to collect, and B, how you're going to reconsider it if somebody complains. So that is something that we're really trying to get librarians to do. And the morale right now, I would say, is we waver between belligerent and fearful. So,
Belligerently fearful.
yes. I talked to a librarian today who said, I said, it depends on how much you want to push back. She says, I can get a job anywhere. So she was belligerent. But I have librarians who are nearing retirement who can't afford to fight and cannot lose their job. So it is a very, very much a continuum of how people are feeling. So.
It feels too as though bookstores are trying to fight back more. We're seeing banned book displays outside of the usual banned books week that we've all been seeing for the last 30 years. Just 2 weeks ago at the AWP conference in Seattle, PEN America had a huge display of what's your favorite banned book and so on. What, if any, impact is this private business and organizations taking up the fight? Is it helping? Is it hindering? Any sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, I know that we had, there's a bookstore in University City called I See Me. That's an African American bookstore and children's bookstore. And when Wentzville banned the Bluest Eye, they took in donations and then sent out the Bluest Eye to anybody who wanted to. So I guess in that respect, private businesses can help with access, but we cannot be relying on private businesses to do that.
I think something similar happened when Mouse was first censored, that somebody, I can't remember the organization, but took up donations to give away free copies as much as possible.
I just want, I had the privilege of hearing Art Spiegelman speak about his book, Mouse, being banned, and this will stay with me for the rest of my life. He took questions from students, and a little girl asked, if our schools are banning books, how do we know that they're, telling us the truth and looking out for our best interests? And Art Spiegelman said, my dear, you cannot. So that is something that I really took away from that Mouse banning, and I was very privileged to hear, and it still gives me chills to talk about. So
There has always been a stark difference in the ways that Illinois and Missouri approach societal issues. This is me using my nice words. Which is doubly strange for those of us that live right here on the border. While Missouri might be arguing over which books to ban, Illinois just proposed a new law that would tie state funding for school libraries and public libraries to policies explicitly preventing book banning and restricting access to books and other materials, basically mandating intellectual freedom in Illinois. And as far as I know, this would be the first such bill in the U.S. How familiar are you guys with this? What do you think its impact could be? Maybe it could catch on.
When you look at the number of states that are currently banning, I think PEN America said it's 32 states that
Something
currently
like that.
have bans on books. So even if the Illinois law catches, it still will be in the minority in terms of states.
we've been watching this very closely at my organization, and as those of you who remember Schoolhouse Rock, there is still a long way to go. So we're watching it very closely. We're interested. We're hopeful. I would say that is our basic feeling about that law at this point. We're hopeful that it will make a difference.
We're running low on our questions, so Sigmas, if you've got my index cards, or if you have not yet given your question to Tara there, please go hand her your question. We've spoken some about how these things spread, that just because books aren't being banned here in Edwardsville, Illinois, doesn't mean that we're not impacted by it. What can people do here that protects the written word and that fights back against this censorship?
Well, I would like to suggest that you run for a school board or a library board. We need pro-intellectual freedom candidates. And if you can't do that, then vote. Vote for the people that will support intellectual freedom. And at the very least, call your school or call your library and tell them that you support the right to read. And make sure that your voice is heard and that they're not just getting complaints about what they have in the library. Call your superintendent or call the director of your library and tell them that it's very important to you that they continue to provide books for all patrons.
I come from an old tradition of activism. One of my mentors is currently 92 years old, and he still practices law. His name is Fred Gray. He was the lawyer for Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King during the Civil Rights Movement. The area of activism I come from says that you don't consider your own well-being in trying to make systemic change. If you're concerned about losing your job or going to jail, then you're not really in the fight. Complying with a law because compliance benefits you make you just as culpable in that law. And so I would encourage you guys, well, because we live in Illinois, we know that's not an issue, but most of us have friends, family members on the Missouri side or in one of these states, and we have to encourage them to be willing to risk something to change the system. That is the exact same question I asked face-to-face at the President's University, Dr. Dan Mahoney. I said, what are you willing to risk to make sure that Black people and gay people and women are treated like everybody else? And he said, I am willing to risk my job. If it costs me my job, I'll make it happen. To me, that's allyship. That's getting in the fight. And so on this issue of banned books, get in the fight and be willing to risk something. Because if you don't change the system, if you go along with the system, simply because your particular circumstances don't change, you're just as culpable in the disadvantages the system creates.
Subscribe to your local newspaper.
I'm always a fan of that one myself.
But seriously, if nobody's watching what school boards are doing, if nobody's watching what your city councils are doing, then democracy dies in darkness.
There's far fewer reporters on that grass level than there used to be, even back when I was reporting full time, certainly. All right, I have a whole bunch of index cards. So these are from our audience. Let's see, which one? Board of Education versus PICO faced the Supreme Court in 1982, and they ruled banning books was an infringement on students' First Amendment rights. Historically, the Supreme Court has recognized the right to receive information under the First Amendment if one of these cases gets to the Supreme Court. Do you see the conservative majority overturning PICO?
That particular court ruling is at the center of the ACLU's lawsuit against the state of Missouri currently right now. And so what the state has done is they have reacted by reducing the funds to state libraries in the state of Missouri. So where they're saying now it's not an act that we're infringing upon their First Amendment rights, we just don't have the money to house all of those books.
So the next question was, what type of book has been banned the most? And why do you think they're banning that type of book specifically?
The books that we have seen banned the most are, unfortunately, anything that deals with sexuality, especially any LGBTQIA books. When I started this job, I've only been doing this job for about a year. It's kind of taken over my life. I love it. Yes. One of the first books that I got called about was Drama by Raina Telgemeier. It's a book for 10-year-olds, and it's about a school that puts on a play, and a parent complained because one of the side characters is questioning whether he likes boys or not. And so we have seen so much of that. Now, I realize that may not be the majority, but that's what we're seeing in the southern Illinois area.
Again, I'm using PEN America. I think they said genderqueer is the most banned book currently. And there's a lot of targeting of queer books. And I think this is dangerous, and I think it's going to result in real harm against non-heteronormative people. And I'm going to tell you why from a political perspective. A lot of the politicians are using these word salads, or just a bunch of words together when they talk about these things. So you'll hear words like queer, transgender, and in the same sentence you'll hear pornography and pedophilia. And that may not necessarily seem to trigger anything, but subconsciously what that does is that makes you associate that group with that particular practice. And so what it creates a sense of fear when someone sees this particular group represented out in public in a book, and because they're triggered that this group represents this practice. And I really believe this is going to cause really bodily harm against particularly transgender individuals. We've seen it with people bringing guns to drag queen readings of books for children. We've seen it with people targeting LGBTQI spots. I'm scared to a real sense that the next mass shooting, and I know this sounds really weird, there was just one yesterday, won't be in a school, but it's going to be in a supposed safe zone, which won't be safe because of the association of identities with these practices.
Many feel that the history books being used to educate kids in school are one-sided or lacking information. How do you all feel about that?
I think we all probably agree with that.
There's probably a consensus.
Yeah, I think that's part of the irony of this whole thing.
And that's why they want to ban books, the books that go outside that narrative.
Yes.
when it comes to books like Little House on the Prairie, how does the board feel about the statement, learn about it so history doesn't repeat itself? Take your time.
That's a tough one because I would never want to cause harm to a child. I mean, I became a teacher. I forgot to say my education in my bio, but I do.
Oh.
I am a teacher.
I figured you had one.
I have an education. No, I have a library degree and I have a teaching degree. So I first and foremost think of myself as a teacher. And as I said, I grew up with the Little House on the Prairie books, and I loved them, right? I thought they were great. Well, now that I know, as Maya Angelou says, do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. That's how I feel about those books. Because if I read that book aloud to a class and there were Native American children in my class, I would feel terrible. So I don't know that they should go away, but I don't think they should be taught. That's a very fine line to walk. They are there, they exist, and they're proof of what happened and how people thought, but I really think they should not be taught.
I struggle to see the difference between Little House on the Prairie and a standard history book in a third grade classroom. Do you realize how upset I was when I realized that the Pilgrims and the Indians didn't really sit down happily and start Thanksgiving? That was what I was taught until I was in the fourth grade, that Pilgrims and the Indians were harmonious, two groups of people that sat down and started the holiday of Thanksgiving. That's a complete fabrication. But that's literally in our textbooks. So what's the difference between that and Little House on the Prairie? If Little House on the Prairie doesn't need to be taught, there needs to be a serious overhaul of our history books.
We might have already addressed this, but how closely related are the bans on books and the bans on trans bodies? I think we've already talked a little bit about how much of focus there's been on LGBTQ issues in this.
One of the biggest issues that we're hearing from our public libraries is if they plan any kind of a drag queen story time. And even if it's just, marketed as being fun and funny, there's been a lot of pretty significant backlash. So I would say they're very closely tied together.
And this was somewhat related. How does anti-CRT and transphobic rhetoric in the political sphere relate to book bans across the country? And could this attack on books be viewed as part of a larger attack on education itself?
That's a heavy question.
Who wants to go with that one?
I think I touched on that earlier, how some of the funding behind these groups are, libertarian or right-wing conservative think tanks like Heritage Foundation that have an ultimate goal of abolishing public education, abolishing the Department of Education. So I think this is, I think it is, there is a bigger picture. But in the meantime, it's real kids that are hurt.
This one's for Dr. Lewis specifically. What will it take for these people doing these things to stop looking for boogeymen and face the real monsters in the mirror?
They won't. Their privilege allows them to continue to create someone else as the enemy. One of the manifestations of white privilege, as described by Corey and Collins, 2018, if you want to check my citations, is that white privilege, it excuses you from self-accountability. You never have to be introspective because the system is made for you. So those individuals identify as white and are introspective, they're doing that of their own volition. But there is nothing in the system compelling them to do that. So they can always create the boogeyman. There's nothing stopping them from doing that.
With a ban on books being on the rise nationwide. What stops politicians from next banning the curriculum taught, which students are allowed to learn, which teachers that are allowed to teach, such as queer or minority students and teachers?
Nothing. I mean, we're already seeing
We're already
that.
seeing it.
We are already,
Um,
yep.
With AP, African American history,
The Don't Say Gay law in Florida,
Yeah.
they're not
Oh, I
allowed,
forgot
yeah.
about that
Mhm.
one.
yeah, the train has left the station. I mean, yeah.
It's a slippery slope and we're already sliding down it.
So then I'll bring it back to the question we started on earlier. What can we do? We talked about voting, we talked about getting involved in activism. Is there anything else that we can recommend that can be a call to action for those who care about this issue?
Read. I know that
a
sounds
good
really weird, but I told you half of the story of Frederick Douglass earlier. What Frederick Douglass did, because Hugo Hall eventually did stop his wife, Sophia, from teaching Frederick Douglass how to read. The slave children that, not the slave children, the white children that Frederick Douglass had to cater to as a slave boy, he actually tricked them into teaching him how to read. He was determined just to keep reading and find out whatever information he can find out. And I know sometimes your professors assign reading that is boring. I'm going to call it boring at times, 'cause sometimes it is.
Never.
But keep reading. Read fiction, read nonfiction, read biographies, read transcripts, read newspapers. Keep reading. The more knowledgeable you are, the less likely people can trick you into being distracted by the boogeyman.
The other thing I want to say about being a voice for a call for change is, I always say, listen as closely to what people don't say as what they do say. So if they're telling you what they want you to know, go find out what they don't want you to know.
And any more from you, Blythe?
I mean, read and encourage the children in your lives to read. I talked to an author named Jerry Kraft, and he wrote a book called New Kid that's been banned, and he said, I'm writing the books I wanted to read when I was a kid. And when we talk about what it means to see yourself in books, and for white kids to see black kids and black kids to see, black kids to see themselves, it's he said, all I had was it's a book about a slave, it's a book about a civil rights activist, or it's a book about Michael Jordan. That's what we had. So he's writing books about regular kids doing regular things, and I think that's important to just humanize each other. If you're a white kid in an all-white school with all-white teachers and all you're reading about are historical figures, I mean, then that makes the black person the other. It makes them somehow separate and different. So I think that's important too. It's just the exposure to all different kinds of characters and all different kinds of books, fiction, nonfiction, and
Graphic.
graphic
Novels.
novels.
Yes, graphic novels.
Yes.
All right, the last question. What's your favorite banned book? I'll jump on it first since I didn't prepare you for that one. Right now it's a tie between Sula, which I've read in 2 different classes here at SIUE by Toni Morrison, and The Awakening by Kate Chopin, which I have studied and written about in a couple of classes, and it was challenged based on sexual content, which is written in 1899 in such vague language that most of the time the undergrads can't tell that a sex scene actually happened. So I've always found that hilarious, and that my runner-up would be that just because I find it hilarious that Fahrenheit 451 is frequently banned. Your favorite banned books?
My first, of course, is Beloved. There's one that's not as frequently banned, but I did see it on one list. It's called Giovanni's Room, written by James Baldwin, written during the 1960s. James Baldwin was just genius with words. And that book is from a person who was living as black and gay in the 1960s, which wasn't easy. But it's just a great read, so those would be my two.
Okay.
I'm going to answer from a kid's perspective because for 14 years as a middle school librarian, I didn't get to read a lot of adult books. So my favorite banned book is Drama by Raina Telgemeier. It's a joyful book, and I loved it, and kids love it.
The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, yes. All right. I want to thank you very much for sharing your perspectives and your expertise. And thank you all for coming and listening to us. Go read books. I drink too much.